It was a Tuesday evening, and the office had closed early for a power outage. I thought it was a perfect chance to surprise my wife, Catherine, by coming home a bit sooner than usual. The drive back was calm, with the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the suburban streets. I parked the car, grabbed the bottle of wine I'd picked up, and headed inside. As I opened the door, I heard Catherine's voice. It wasn't the usual casual tone she used when talking to friends or family. There was an urgency, a kind of passion in her voice that caught me off guard. I moved quietly toward the kitchen, trying not to alert her to my presence. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something about the situation made me hesitate to announce my arrival. When I peeked around the corner, I saw her sitting at the dining table, her laptop open in front of her, surrounded by a stack of books and papers. On the screen was an image of a bird, something exotic that I didn't recognize. Catherine was engrossed, flipping through pages and typing quickly. I watched as she paused, gazed at the screen with an intensity I hadn't seen in a while, and then scribbled something in her notebook. This wasn't the Catherine I knew. She had always been interested in nature, but this level of obsession was new. I stepped into the room, and she nearly jumped out of her seat, slamming the laptop shut as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. "Oh, Mike, you're home early," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "I wasn't expecting you." "Yeah, power went out at work. What are you up to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just, reading up on some environmental stuff," she said, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "I've been thinking about getting more involved in nature conservation. There's this club I found, the Nature Enthusiasts." "That sounds interesting," I replied, although something about her demeanor left me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this sudden interest than she was letting on. The next morning, over breakfast, Catherine mentioned the club again. "I think I'm going to join the Nature Enthusiasts," she said, stirring her coffee. "They do a lot of great work. Cleanups, educational talks, hikes. It could be a good way to get out more." I nodded, though I still felt a twinge of discomfort. "Sounds like a good idea. Do you know anyone else who's a member?" "Not really," she admitted, "but I'm sure I'll meet some interesting people. I could use a new hobby." In the weeks that followed, Catherine became increasingly involved with the club. She attended meetings every Thursday night and participated in weekend activities. At first, I was happy to see her so enthusiastic about something, but soon I noticed a change. She was distant, often lost in thought, and sometimes, when I asked her about the club, she would give vague answers or change the subject. One Thursday evening, I decided to pick her up after the meeting. I wanted to see for myself what this club was all about. When I arrived at the community center where the meetings were held, I saw Catherine standing outside, chatting animatedly with a group of people. Among them was a tall, handsome man with a rugged look, someone who seemed out of place in our quiet suburban neighborhood. As I approached, I noticed how Catherine's face lit up when she spoke to him. "Hey, babe," I called out as I walked up to them. She turned, and for a split second, I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even guilt, before she smiled and introduced me to her new friends. "This is Jake," she said, gesturing to the man beside her. "He's one of the leaders of the club." Jake reached out to shake my hand, his grip firm, his smile warm. "Nice to meet you, Mike. Catherine's told me a lot about you." "Has she now?" I replied, trying to keep my tone light, but there was an unease growing in my chest. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the way they interacted didn't sit right with me. As the weeks turned into months, Catherine's involvement with the club deepened. She was out more often, sometimes even on weeknights, attending emergency meetings or planning sessions for upcoming events. Her enthusiasm for the club was palpable, but so was the distance that had begun to grow between us. One Saturday morning, as she was packing her bag for yet another hike, I decided to voice my concerns. "Catherine, you've been spending a lot of time with this club. We barely see each other anymore." She paused, her hands stilling over her backpack. "I know, Mike, but this is important to me. It's something I'm passionate about." "And I'm happy for you," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "But it feels like you're pulling away from me." She sighed and walked over to me, placing a hand on my arm. "I'm not pulling away, Mike. I just I need this right now. I promise. It's nothing to worry about. But I was worried. Every time she mentioned the club, every time she came home late, my mind raced with possibilities. I didn't want to be the jealous husband, but the way she talked about Jake, the way she lit up when she mentioned him, made it impossible to ignore the nagging doubts. One evening after she had fallen asleep, I went through her phone. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I needed answers. I found nothing incriminating, no suspicious messages, no calls, but that only made me feel worse. I was becoming paranoid, seeing things that might not even be there. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, one of those days where the weather seemed to trap you indoors with nothing but your thoughts. Catherine had gone out for one of her nature walks with the club, and I was left to my own devices at home. I decided to clean out the closet in the guest bedroom, a task I had been putting off for months. As I sorted through old clothes and forgotten belongings, I noticed a small wooden box nestled in the corner behind some shoes. The box was striking, crafted from dark, polished wood with intricate carvings of leaves and vines curling along its surface. It looked out of place among the mundane items in the closet, as though it held something valuable or meaningful. My curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of items that didn't match Catherine's usual style. There were delicate pieces of jewelry, each one unique and clearly handmade. One necklace was composed of smooth, polished stones, strung together with a thin leather cord, while another piece was a bracelet woven from strands of dried grass and tiny shells. Nestled among the jewelry was a small, dried flower pressed between two pieces of glass, its petals preserved in shades of deep purple and blue. I sat back on my heels, turning the items over in my hands. These weren't the sort of things Catherine typically wore, or even mentioned liking. She was more into modern, elegant jewelry, not this kind of rustic, natural aesthetic. My thoughts immediately jumped to the club, the nature enthusiasts. Had one of her new friends given these to her? When Catherine returned home later that day, drenched from the rain but smiling, I decided to ask her about the box. As she was drying her hair in the bathroom, I brought it up casually. I found something interesting in the guest room closet today, a little wooden box with some jewelry inside. It's beautiful. Where did you get it? She stopped what she was doing for just a fraction of a second before resuming, her movements slightly more deliberate. "Oh, that?" she said, her voice light but with an undercurrent of tension. "It was a gift from one of the club members. We had a craft day a while back and someone made it for me." The answer seemed reasonable enough, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. "Who made it?" I pressed, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "Jake, I think," she replied, her voice still casual, but there was a faint edge to it. "He's really into woodworking. He made one for a few of us, actually." Jake, of course. His name had been cropping up more and more in our conversations, always mentioned in passing, but never with much detail. It was as if he had become a part of her life without me even noticing. And now, here he was again, giving her personal handcrafted gifts. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach, but I forced a smile and nodded. That was nice of him. Catherine smiled back, seemingly satisfied with my response, and continued getting ready. But the conversation lingered in my mind long after it ended. That night, as I lay beside her in bed, I couldn't shake the image of that box and the way she had responded when I brought it up. I tried to tell myself that it was just a friendly gesture, that I was overreacting, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore the growing list of small, unsettling signs. The late-night meetings, the missed calls, the way she spoke about Jake with that glimmer of admiration in her eyes. It all pointed to something I wasn't ready to confront but couldn't keep ignoring. The days that followed were tense, though not outwardly so. Catherine and I went through our usual routines: work, dinner, evenings spent watching TV. But the undercurrent of doubt that had begun to seep into our relationship was impossible to ignore. I noticed things I might have overlooked before, small details that now seemed significant in light of my growing suspicions. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch watching a movie, Catherine's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, and I saw her expression change, just for a moment, before she quickly turned the phone face down. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it set off alarm bells in my mind. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and casual. "Just someone from the club," she replied, not missing a beat. I'll call them back later. Something about her response didn't sit right with me. Catherine had always been the type to answer her phone right away, especially when it was someone she knew. But lately, I had noticed that she was letting certain calls go to voicemail, often when I was around. It was a subtle change in behavior, but one that didn't escape my notice. After a few minutes, Catherine got up to make some tea, leaving her phone on the table. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but the doubts gnawing at me were too strong to resist. I reached over and picked up her phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The screen showed a missed call, Jake's name staring back at me in bold letters. A wave of unease washed over me, and I quickly put the phone back down, my mind racing. Why had she ignored his call? Was there something going on between them that she didn't want me to know about? The questions swirled in my head, each one more troubling than the last. When Catherine returned with 2 mugs of steaming tea, I forced a smile and accepted mine, though my mind was far from the movie playing on the screen. I kept glancing at her, searching for any sign that might confirm or deny my suspicions, but she seemed relaxed, her focus on the film, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. As the days passed, I became more and more attuned to the small details, how she would quickly put her phone away when I entered the room, the way she would smile to herself after reading a text, the extra care she seemed to put into her appearance before heading out to one of the club meetings. It all added up to a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. I started to feel like an outsider in my own marriage, watching Catherine drift further away with each passing day. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the guarded conversations, it all pointed to something more than just a friendship between her and Jake. One evening, after she had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at her phone on the coffee table. The temptation to check her messages was overwhelming, but I knew that doing so would only deepen the rift between us. Yet, how could I confront her without any proof? How could I accuse her of something I wasn't even sure of myself? The missed calls, the wooden box, the way she talked about Jake. It was all starting to feel like a puzzle I was slowly piecing together, but the final picture was one I dreaded to see. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something was going on between them, something she wasn't telling me. I knew I needed to find out the truth, but I wasn't sure how. Should I confront her directly? Should I follow her to one of the club meetings and see for myself what was going on? The uncertainty was eating away at me, and I knew I couldn't continue like this for much longer. But deep down, I was afraid of what I might discover. What if my suspicions were right? What if the woman I had loved and trusted for years was hiding something from me? The thought was too painful to bear, but I couldn't keep living in the dark. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. The following week, I decided I couldn't sit idly by any longer. The constant second-guessing, the gnawing doubt. I needed to put an end to it. I had to know the truth about what was going on between Catherine and Jake, even if it meant confronting the possibility of betrayal. My opportunity came sooner than expected. On Thursday morning, Catherine mentioned that the club was planning a day-long hike on Saturday to survey some new land for conservation. She seemed excited, but when I offered to come along, she hesitated. "Oh, Mike, it's going to be a long, exhausting day," she said, her voice carrying that too bright tone that made me wary. "I wouldn't want you to feel like you have to come. Besides, I know you have that project at work you've been trying to wrap up." I nodded, pretending to agree. "You're right. I probably shouldn't overextend myself, but I'll miss spending the day with you." She smiled, leaned over, and kissed my cheek. "We'll have Sunday together, promise." As soon as she left for work, I began to formulate a plan. If she didn't want me to come along, I'd follow at a distance. I'd see for myself what was going on, without her knowing. The thought made me feel guilty, but I couldn't ignore the tightness in my chest every time I thought about Jake. Saturday morning arrived, cloudy and cool, a perfect day for a hike. Catherine was up early, packing her gear and chatting away about the trail they'd be exploring. I acted nonchalant, sipping my coffee and nodding along, but inside I was wound tight, ready to spring into action the moment she left. As soon as she drove off, I grabbed my own hiking gear and followed. I kept my distance, careful not to get too close. The road led out of town, winding through the countryside until it reached the edge of a dense forest. I parked a ways down the road, out of sight, and began walking. The trail was narrow, cutting through thick underbrush and tall trees. I kept to the side, making sure to stay hidden. After about an hour of steady walking, I heard voices up ahead. I slowed my pace, moving quietly until I could see them through the trees. There was the group, gathered around a map spread out on the ground. Catherine stood near Jake, and my stomach turned as I watched them. They seemed at ease with each other, laughing and talking in a way that felt too familiar. I edged closer, trying to hear what they were saying. "And we'll need to mark that area off," Jake was saying, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's a prime nesting ground." Catherine nodded, her eyes on him, not the map. "You've really put a lot of thought into this. It's impressive." He smiled at her, that same warm smile that had made me uneasy the first time we met. "Thanks, but I couldn't do it without the help of everyone here." They continued talking, but I didn't hear the rest. My focus was on the way they stood close together, the way their hands brushed when they pointed at the map. It could all be innocent, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. As the group prepared to move on, I stayed back, my heart pounding. I had seen enough to confirm my worst fears. There was something between them, something that went beyond friendship, but I needed more. I needed proof. I decided to continue following them, waiting for a moment when I might catch them alone together. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and the group's conversations faded into the background as they spread out to explore different areas. I kept my distance, careful not to make a sound. About an hour into the hike, I saw my chance. The group had split into pairs to cover more ground, and Catherine had ended up with Jake. They moved off the main trail, heading toward a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. I followed at a safe distance, ducking behind trees whenever they paused. As they reached the clearing, they stopped and began talking, their voices low but clear enough for me to hear. I crouched behind a large oak, straining to catch every word. "This place is beautiful," Catherine said, looking around. "It's so peaceful." Jake nodded, his eyes on her instead of the scenery. "It is. It's one of my favorite spots." They stood in silence for a moment, just taking in the surroundings. Then Jake spoke again, his tone softer. "Catherine, I've been meaning to talk to you about something." My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading. Catherine turned to him, her expression curious. "What is it?" Jake hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. "I've really enjoyed getting to know you these past few months. You're something special." My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I wanted to burst out from my hiding place, to shout at them, to demand answers, but I stayed frozen, too afraid of what I might hear next. Catherine didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she looked down at their joined hands, her face a mix of emotions I couldn't quite read from my vantage point. "Jake, she started, but her voice trailed off. He took a step closer, his voice low and earnest. "I know you're married, and I don't want to cause any trouble, but I can't stop thinking about you. I just needed to tell you how I feel." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I held my breath, waiting for Catherine's response. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that made my heart sink. "Jake, I care about you too, but this is complicated." He didn't let go of her hand. "I know it is, but I can't pretend anymore. Being around you, working with you, it's made me realize that I want more than just a friendship." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my legs shaking as I stepped out from behind the tree. "Catherine!" Both of them jumped, their hands snapping apart as they turned to face me. Catherine's eyes widened in shock, and Jake's expression quickly shifted from surprise to something more guarded. "Mike!" Catherine gasped, taking a step toward me. "What are you doing here?" I stared at them, my mind racing, my emotions a tangled mess. "I could ask you the same thing." Jake glanced between us, his face tense. "Mike, this isn't what it looks like." "Isn't it?" I shot back, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "I heard everything, Jake. I saw everything." Catherine looked like she was on the verge of tears. "Mike, please, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like you're having an affair." The word hung in the air, heavy and awful. Catherine flinched, and Jake stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Jake said quietly. I care about her, But we haven't crossed any lines, I swear. I looked at Catherine, waiting for her to deny it, to tell me that Jake was lying, that there was nothing between them. But she didn't say a word. Her silence was answer enough. The walk back to the trailhead was the longest and most agonizing hour of my life. The group had already reconvened, and thankfully Catherine and I managed to stay out of their sight as we made our way back to the cars. Neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Jake had offered to talk things out, but I couldn't stand the sight of him. The way he looked at Catherine, the way she hesitated before pulling away, it was all too much. I had asked him to give us space, and he reluctantly agreed, heading off with the rest of the group while Catherine and I made our way to the car. When we finally reached the parking lot, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. Catherine stood by the passenger door, her eyes downcast. I didn't know what to say to her, how to start the conversation that would inevitably lead to a confrontation I wasn't ready to have. We got into the car and I started the engine, the sound of it breaking the heavy silence. I pulled out of the lot and onto the road, the tension between us palpable. I wanted to scream, to shout at her, to demand answers, but the words were stuck in my throat, choked by the hurt and betrayal I felt. For the first few miles we didn't speak. The silence was unbearable, each second stretching out like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Finally, Catherine broke the silence, her voice small and tentative. "Mike, please, can we talk about this?" I didn't respond at first. My jaw clenched as I tried to keep my emotions in check. But the anger and pain were too much to contain. "About how you've been lying to me? About how you've been hiding things? About how you've been spending all this time with Jake, making me feel like an idiot?" Catherine winced at the venom in my voice, her eyes welling up with tears. "Mike, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to get this far. I didn't know how to handle it." I could barely believe what I was hearing. "Handle it? You're my wife, Catherine. You don't handle something like this. You tell me the truth. You come to me before it gets to this point." She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled as she sobbed. I know I should have told you, but I didn't want to hurt you, and I didn't want to admit that I was feeling something I shouldn't have." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some harmless flirtation or a misunderstanding. She was admitting that she had feelings for him, feelings that she had kept hidden from me, her husband. "You should have talked to me," I said, my voice trembling. "You should have come to me before it got to this. Now I don't even know who you are anymore." "I'm still me, Mike," she pleaded, reaching out to touch my arm. "I'm still your wife. I love you." I pulled away from her touch, my heart breaking all over again. "Do you? Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you've been slipping away from me, one lie at a time." She cried harder, and for a moment I hated myself for making her feel this way. But then I remembered the look on her face when Jake took her hand, the way she didn't immediately pull away. That image was seared into my mind, and it filled me with a cold, hard resolve. "What happens now, Catherine?" I asked, my voice flat. "Are you going to leave me for him? Is that what this is?" "No!" she cried out, her voice desperate. "I don't want to leave you, Mike. I don't want to be with Jake. I got confused, and I let things get out of control. But I don't want to lose you. Please believe me." I didn't answer right away. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that our marriage, the life we had built together, had been shaken to its core. "We'll talk about it when we get home," I finally said, my voice emotionless. "But right now, I just need to think." Catherine nodded silently, wiping away her tears, and we continued the drive in a heavy, oppressive silence. I didn't know what the future held for us, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. When we arrived home, the weight of the earlier confrontation hung over us like a dark cloud. The house, once our refuge, now felt cold and uninviting. We walked through the door in silence, the only sound the soft click as I locked it behind us. Catherine hesitated in the hallway, her eyes flickering toward me as if she wanted to say something, but I couldn't bear to hear any more apologies or explanations. "I'm going to bed," I muttered, not waiting for her response. As I climbed the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying the full burden of our crumbling marriage on my back. The bedroom was dark, the sheets neatly folded back where we had left them that morning. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the spot where Catherine usually slept. The space seemed emptier than ever, despite her being just downstairs. I couldn't bring myself to lie down. Instead, I grabbed a pillow and a blanket and retreated to the living room, leaving the door to our bedroom open behind me as if hoping she might follow. But she didn't. That night, I lay awake on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened over the past few months. I kept going over every conversation, every interaction, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything had started to go wrong. When had Catherine begun to drift away? Was it when she joined the club? Or had the seeds of this distance been planted long before and I just hadn't noticed? The thoughts swirled in my mind until exhaustion finally pulled me under. My dreams haunted by images of Catherine and Jake in that forest clearing, their hands intertwined as if they were meant to be together. Morning came too soon, and with it, the painful reality that nothing had changed. I woke up stiff and unrested, the events of the previous day rushing back with brutal clarity. The sunlight streaming through the curtains did nothing to lift the heaviness in my chest. Catherine was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee in front of her. Her eyes were red and puffy, the remnants of tears still visible on her cheeks. I could tell she hadn't slept much either. "Morning," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Morning," I replied, not meeting her gaze. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us louder than any argument. We sat there for a long time, neither of us speaking, the tension building with every passing second. I knew we couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between us. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was now shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. Finally, Catherine broke the silence. "Mike, we need to talk. Really talk. About everything." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation. But we couldn't keep avoiding it. We couldn't keep living in this limbo, pretending that things might somehow go back to the way they were. We moved to the living room, sitting across from each other on opposite ends of the couch. The distance between us felt like a chasm, and I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back to each other. "I don't even know where to start," Catherine admitted, her voice shaky. "I know I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to understand. It wasn't intentional. I never meant to betray you." "Then why did it happen?" I asked, my voice hoarse with the pain I had been holding in. "Why did you let it get this far?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I don't know. I think I was lonely. I felt like we were drifting apart, even before I joined the club. And when I met Jake, he made me feel noticed in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. But that's not an excuse. I should have talked to you instead of letting it go this far." Her words cut deep, confirming the fears I had been grappling with for weeks. "So what now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where do we go from here?" "I don't want to lose you, Mike," she said, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I love you, and I want to fix this, but I know it's going to take time, and I know I have to earn back your trust." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could find a way to move past this, that we could rebuild what had been broken. But the doubts still lingered, the images of her with Jake still fresh in my mind. "We'll take it one day at a time," I finally said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But things have to change. We both have to work on this, or it's never going to get better." Catherine nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mike. I promise." But as we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much we wanted to fix things, some wounds were too deep to fully heal. The days that followed were strained, filled with awkward silences and forced conversations. Catherine and I tried to act normal, but it was clear that the wound between us was still raw. We talked about mundane things, work, groceries, the weather, but the real issue, the betrayal, hung in the air like a dark cloud, always present, always just below the surface. I found myself pulling away from her, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't intentional, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was the image of her and Jake in that clearing. It was like a movie playing on a loop in my head, impossible to turn off. I wanted to move past it, to forgive her and rebuild what we had, but the hurt was still too fresh, too overwhelming. Catherine noticed the distance, of course. She tried to reach out, to bridge the gap, but each time she did, I found myself recoiling, the bitterness and anger rising up inside me like bile. One evening, about a week after our confrontation, she came home from work with a determined look on her face. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV without really watching anything. She stood in the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides. "We can't keep doing this, Mike," she said, her voice firm. "We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." I looked up at her, my chest tightening. "I know," I replied, though I wasn't sure what else to say. "Then let's talk about it," she insisted, walking over and sitting down on the couch beside me. "We need to deal with this, or it's going to destroy us." I turned off the TV, taking a deep breath. "I don't know how to get past this, Catherine," I admitted, my voice cracking with the weight of my emotions. "Every time I try to forget, I can't stop seeing you with him." She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched mine. "I'm so sorry, Mike. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I love you, and I want to make this right. Please, just give me a chance." I looked into her eyes, searching for the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. She was still there beneath the pain and the guilt, but so was the doubt, the mistrust that had taken root in my heart. "I'm trying, Catherine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard. It's so damn hard." "I know," she whispered back, tears filling her eyes. "But we can't give up on us. We've been through too much together." For the first time since that awful day in the woods, I felt a flicker of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but I wasn't ready to give up on our marriage just yet. "I'm not giving up," I said, squeezing her hand. "But we need to take it slow. We need to rebuild the trust, piece by piece." She nodded, wiping away her tears. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mike. I promise." And so, we began the slow, painful process of rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when the pain was too much to bear, but we were trying. We were fighting for our marriage, for the life we had built together, and that was all we could do. As the weeks passed, Catherine and I settled into a fragile truce. The distance between us remained, but we were working on it, one cautious step at a time. We had agreed to attend couples therapy, something neither of us had ever imagined needing, but it felt like the right thing to do. If we were going to have any chance of saving our marriage, we needed help navigating the stormy waters we found ourselves in. The first few sessions were difficult, to say the least. Talking about our problems with a stranger felt uncomfortable, even invasive. But the therapist, Dr. Winters, had a way of guiding us through the conversation, helping us to see things from each other's perspectives. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was a start. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Catherine and I were sitting in the living room, both lost in our own thoughts. The silence between us was no longer as suffocating as it had been, but it was still heavy with unspoken words. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the quiet. I picked it up, my brow furrowing as I saw a message from an unknown number. "Who is it?" Catherine asked, noticing my reaction. "Not sure," I muttered, opening the message. It was a short, simple text. "Club meeting this Saturday. We'd love for you to join us." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Why would the club be reaching out to me? I hadn't attended any of their events since that day in the woods, and I certainly hadn't expressed any interest in going back. Yet here was this invitation, almost as if nothing had happened. "Is it them?" Catherine asked, her voice tense. "Yeah," I said, still trying to wrap my head around it. "They're inviting me to a meeting on Saturday." Catherine's face paled. Are you going to go?" I hadn't considered it, not seriously. The idea of being around those people, of seeing Jake again, was the last thing I wanted. But as I sat there, the thought began to take root in my mind. Maybe going back to the club, facing everything head on, was what I needed to do. Not just for myself, but for our marriage. Maybe it was time to confront the ghosts of what had happened, to put the past behind us once and for all. "I don't know," I finally replied, my voice uncertain. "Maybe I should." Maybe it's time to face this, instead of running away. Catherine looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. If you think it will help, then I support you. Just be careful, Mike. Please. I nodded, knowing she was right to worry. But something inside me was pushing me toward this decision. A need to reclaim what had been taken from me, to take control of the situation, rather than letting it control me. I'll think about it, I said, more to reassure her than anything else. But in my heart, I knew that I had already made up my mind. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Saturday arrived with a mixture of dread and determination. I woke up early, unable to shake the feeling of impending confrontation that hung over the day. Catherine was unusually quiet as we prepared breakfast, her eyes following me with a concern she couldn't quite mask. I still think you're brave for doing this, she finally said, breaking the silence. But if it gets too much, don't feel like you have to stay. Her words were comforting, but they didn't ease the tight knot in my stomach. I'll be fine, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I just need to face this and see where we stand. After a tense, wordless drive, I found myself standing in front of the small building where the club meetings were held. It was a modest structure, surrounded by trees and greenery, almost idyllic in its simplicity. But the memories tied to this place tainted its peaceful exterior. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The familiar scent of pine and earth greeted me, but it did little to calm my nerves. The room was already half full, people mingling and chatting in low tones. I scanned the faces looking for Jake, but he was nowhere to be seen, yet. As I walked deeper into the room, I felt eyes on me. Whispers followed, a mix of curiosity and perhaps a bit of unease. I hadn't expected a warm welcome, but I also didn't anticipate feeling like a stranger among people who once felt like friends. I found a seat in the corner, away from the center of attention, and waited. The meeting began with the usual announcements and discussions of upcoming events. I tried to focus, but my mind was elsewhere, distracted by the anticipation of what was to come. And then, just as I thought I might make it through without incident, the door opened and Jake walked in. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The tension was palpable, a silent challenge hanging between us. He hesitated, as if considering whether to approach me, but then he turned and joined a group of people on the other side of the room, avoiding direct contact. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed, but I knew I couldn't leave things like this. After the meeting ended, I waited until most of the members had left before making my way over to him. He was talking to someone, but when he saw me approaching, he excused himself and stepped aside, waiting for me to speak. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm but calm. Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I think we do." We found a quiet spot outside, away from prying eyes and ears. The air was cool, the scent of the forest around us almost overwhelming. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. "I'm not here to fight," I began, forcing myself to remain composed. "I just need to understand." "Why?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Mike. I never meant to cause any trouble. But Catherine, she was lonely, and we connected. It wasn't planned." "That's not an excuse," I shot back, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You knew she was married. You knew what you were doing." "I know," he admitted, looking genuinely remorseful. "And I regret it. But she came to me, Mike. She was hurting, and I didn't stop it. I should have, but I didn't." His words only deepened the wound, confirming what I had feared. "You betrayed my trust," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Both of you did, and now I'm left trying to pick up the pieces." Jake didn't have a response to that, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I'm sorry," he finally said, and for the first time I believed him. If I could take it back, I would. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to punch him, to lash out, and make him feel the pain I had been carrying. But another part of me just wanted to let it go, to move on and start healing. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. "Stay away from her," I said, my voice low and steady. "And stay away from us." Jake nodded, accepting my terms without argument. "You have my word." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him and the club behind. As I got into my car, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control. The days following my confrontation with Jake were a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. On one hand, I had finally taken a step toward confronting the past, but on the other, I knew that true healing would take time and effort from both Catherine and me. We continued with therapy, delving deeper into the issues that had led us to this point. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were making no progress at all. But slowly, I began to see changes in both of us. We were talking more, really talking, about our fears, our insecurities, and the mistakes we had made. Catherine was more open than she had ever been, sharing feelings and thoughts that she had kept buried for years. I listened, really listened, trying to understand her perspective, even when it was painful to hear. She told me about the loneliness she had felt, the distance she had sensed growing between us, long before Jake came into the picture. It was hard to hear, but it was necessary. In return, I opened up about my own struggles, the anger, the betrayal, and the fear that we might never get back to where we were. I admitted that I had been neglectful, that I hadn't seen the warning signs until it was too late. It was a humbling experience, but it was also cathartic. For the first time, we were addressing the root of our problems, not just the symptoms. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice small changes in our relationship. The tension that had once filled our home slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. We started spending more time together, not just out of obligation, but because we wanted to. We went on walks, talked about our day, and even laughed together again. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, of pain. But it was progress, and that was enough. One evening, after a particularly good day, Catherine surprised me by suggesting that we revisit the place where it had all started, the forest where she had first met Jake. My initial reaction was one of hesitation, but I could see in her eyes that this was important to her, a way to close that chapter of our lives and move forward. "Are you sure?" I asked, searching her face for any signs of uncertainty. She nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes, I think it's time to face it together." And so, the following weekend, we drove out to the forest. The drive was quiet, but not tense, more like a shared understanding of what this trip meant for both of us. When we arrived, the familiar sights and smells brought a rush of memories, but they felt distant, like echoes of a past that no longer had power over us. We walked the trails in silence, side by side, until we reached the clearing where everything had come to a head. Catherine stopped, taking a deep breath as she looked around. "This place, it doesn't hold the same power over me anymore," she said, her voice steady. "It's just a place now." I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it. We stood there for a long moment, letting the past settle into the earth beneath our feet. Then, with a shared glance, we turned and walked away, leaving the clearing behind us. Returning from the forest, Catherine and I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The visit had been a symbolic act, a way of reclaiming what had once been lost. But we both knew that the real work of rebuilding our marriage was far from over. We threw ourselves into the process, determined to create a stronger foundation than before. One of the biggest changes was our commitment to better communication. We made a pact to be honest with each other, no matter how uncomfortable the conversations might be. It wasn't always easy, but it was essential. We also made time for each other in ways we hadn't before. Date nights became a regular occurrence, and we took up new hobbies together, things that we both enjoyed rather than activities that one of us simply tolerated for the other's sake. It was a way of reconnecting, of rediscovering the things that had brought us together in the first place. There were still rough patches, of course. Trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight, and there were times when old wounds resurfaced, threatening to pull us back into the darkness. But each time we faced them head-on, determined not to let them define our future. One evening, as we were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset, Catherine turned to me with a serious expression. "Mike, there's something I need to say," she began, her voice soft but resolute. I looked at her, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "I want you to know that I'm truly sorry for what happened. I know I've apologized before, but I need you to understand that I regret the pain I caused you every single day, and I'm committed to making this right, to rebuilding what we lost." Her words hit me like a wave, filled with a sincerity that left no room for doubt. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, nodding as I took her hand in mine. "I know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And I forgive you, Catherine. I really do. I just want us to move forward, to keep building this new life together." She smiled, a mixture of relief and hope in her eyes. "Me too." We sat there in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. In that moment, I realized that we had turned a corner. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were truly living again, with a future that held promise rather than pain. As the months passed, Catherine and I continued to strengthen our relationship. We had come a long way from the days of doubt and betrayal, and though the scars would always be there, they were now a testament to the battles we had fought and won. One day, as we were planning a weekend getaway, Catherine suggested something that took me by surprise. "What if we went camping?" she asked, a hint of excitement in her voice. I blinked, taken aback by the idea. "Camping? Really?" She nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "Yeah, I think it would be good for us, a way to reconnect with nature, with each other. Besides, it's been a long time since we did something adventurous together." The idea grew on me the more I thought about it. Camping had been something we used to enjoy before life got in the way, and the thought of returning to that carefree, adventurous spirit was appealing. "You know what? Let's do it." That weekend, we packed up the car and headed to a remote campsite in the mountains. The drive was beautiful, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to dense forests as we made our way to the secluded spot. When we arrived, the air was crisp and clean, the scent of pine and earth filling our lungs. Setting up camp was a team effort, and as we worked together, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. This was what I had been missing, the simple pleasure of working side by side with the woman I loved, creating something together. As the sun set, we built a fire and settled down to enjoy the warmth and the quiet. The stars above were brilliant, unpolluted by city lights, and the sounds of the forest created a soothing backdrop. It was peaceful, a perfect end to a day that had been about more than just camping. It was about reclaiming our bond, about proving to ourselves that we could move forward. Catherine leaned against me, her head on my shoulder as we stared into the flames. "This feels right," she said softly, her voice filled with contentment. I nodded, wrapping my arm around her. "It does. We've been through a lot, but we're stronger for it." She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Thank you, Mike, for not giving up on us." I smiled, kissing her forehead. "Thank you for fighting with me." We stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling softly as we enjoyed the moment. It wasn't just the end of a difficult chapter. It was the beginning of something new, something better. As the fire began to die down, we crawled into our tent, the cool night air making the warmth of the sleeping bags all the more inviting. Lying there in the quiet, with Catherine beside me, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time. We had made it through the storm, and now we were standing on the other side, ready to face whatever came next, together. And that, I realized, was all that mattered.